Well, I was born in Hamburg in Germany in 1937. My parents, my father was German, my mother was English. I like to say she wasn't really English, she was a Geordie, which is sometimes different. But they met at a dance hall in Newcastle in the Oxford Ballroom, and they got married a few years after that, and I was born in 1937. At the time, he was a captain on a collier collecting coal from Newcastle to take to Germany. And of course, this was the Saturday evening dance at the Oxford Ballroom. They were married in Germany. I'm not sure, I think it was 1935. Initially we lived in Hamburg, and then my father, having been a sailor, he was also a navigator. And in those days, aeroplanes were navigated by people, by the stars. And he joined Lufthansa, Lufthansa, as a navigator on aircraft. Then when the war started, 1939, Lufthansa was taken over by the Luftwaffe, and he therefore became a navigator on transport aircraft initially.
Yes. You came along in 1937. What were your earliest recollections of that time?
Well, earliest recollection was really when I must have been nearly 3, because I remember being on a train with my grandmother, and my mother being on the platform waving goodbye. And the reason for that seemed to be that my mother must have been pregnant, because in January 1941, I think, my brother was born in Berlin. So we were obviously living in Berlin at the time, and I stayed with my grandmother in Hamburg. I knew it was Christmas time because there was a Christmas tree there, and I couldn't quite reach the bar of chocolate on the top of the sideboard. So those were earliest recollections, and she was very good. She provided me with semolina with spots of jam on and so on. Really very nice. The problem she had was that she tried to wash the window once before I was there, wash the windows of the outside of the windows of a flat, and overbalanced and fell down and broke a hip as a result. The consequence of that was she should have gone to hospital, but because she was what do you call these Christian science?
Christian Science.
Christian scientists, that's it, thank you. She thought it would all be done by faith. Well, it never was, and she hobbled for the rest of her life. However, that was 1941.
Yes. So there you were by that time in Berlin. What was going on there at the time from your child eyes?
Well, as a child, I remember going to the zoo, and it was very pleasant childhood in those days. I remember once being taken into the street nearby, and there were lots of cars going past, and I was told Adolf Hitler was in one of the cars as they were flashing past, but it didn't mean anything to me. But shortly after that, there were air raids in Berlin, and it was a bit of a novelty really, because all the lights would go out on the street, and we would go and stand on the veranda and look outside and watch the lights of the searchlights moving across the sky looking for aeroplanes, and then at times we could hear the anti-aircraft guns attempting to catch these people who were either passing over or were dropping bombs.
Yes. And so did you go to shelter and things like that?
Yes. Whenever was an air raid was due, we would get to know in different ways. Either the radio would become totally silent, and you'd say, well, something must have caused that. Or there was the air raid siren, or there were warnings on the radio saying bombers approaching from a certain direction, assumed to target a particular town. And then if we knew that, sometimes we were all right, but other times we would get dressed quickly and we would run downstairs into the cellar where usually because of children we had to get dressed, and the rest of the people in the flats were already there.
Yes.
And on one occasion we were sitting there and listening to the aircraft going overhead, and a bomb just dropped either on our house or next door, we're not quite sure which, with a terrific crash. And the light bulbs swung and the ceiling came down, and it was quite unpleasant.
Yes, of course.
But we had, in the corner of the cellar, the wall had been broken down, and that was the purpose of that was an escape in case you had, in case your building was hit, and so that's the direction we went into.
Yes.
But those were my earliest recollections of the war.
And was your house destroyed?
I can't remember. I know we were moved. No, I don't know. I know we moved to East Prussia after that, where my father was stationed, because it was considered to be well away from Berlin. But we kept the flat going, obviously, because according to my mother's records, we kept going back in the summertime, or vice versa. We kept going back occasionally. And then went back to, later on we went to West Prussia. While we were there were some British prisoners of war. And my mother, she mustn't have had her head screwed on properly, but decided to find these prisoners of war, and she found them. They were picking potatoes. So she went and potato picking, bending over, and she got talking to a chap called Tom. That was his second name, I forget his first name. He was a Scotsman. Mm-hmm. And he said they were planning an escape. And so she says, oh, I can help you. And she provided them with my father's binoculars and my father's maps of bombing raids into Russia, and which was very naive of her to do that. But on one side, they managed to escape and got back home very well. And they visited us on one occasion when we came to England, jumping a bit there. But when my father found out that his official maps had gone and could be traced to him, he was quite angry and quite violent with my mother, because we were aliens and we would have been gone to a concentration camp, and so would he.
Yes.
Because he was married to an alien, and obviously his maps had gone to the enemy, and he would have been in really big trouble after that.
So did anything happen, or was it?
No, it was never discovered. So nothing special happened as a result of that, other than this chap and his family visited Whitley Bay in Northumberland and called in to see my mother.
Yes. I mean, one hears of travelling in Germany at that time. You had to have passes and all that sort of stuff. But how was your mother able to move around? Was it simply because your father was there? Well,
obviously, with him having the position he has, we were able to move.
Yes.
But any details of that, I'm not aware of.
No.
We eventually moved to Silesia, Lower Silesia, which is now part of Poland, because it was well away from the Russian front and it was well away from Berlin, the bombing. And
yes.
So this was obviously a place of safety. and of peace and quiet. And we lived there for about 2 to 3 years.
So there you were in Silesia. What was your mother doing at that time? Was she just looking after you and
She was just looking after my brother and I.
Yes.
She had been a teacher in England, and I remember she was attempting to teach me to read. I was 6 or 7 by that time, and I had great problems, and the number of times she read the story, I was repeating it verbatim instead of just reading it.
Yes.
But she was there, and I started going to a school there, which was a village school, which was fascinating in the sense that there must have been about 20-odd young people there, from me being the youngest to older ones, and sitting in rows, and each row was given some work to do, while the teacher was teaching the others. And so it was 5 classrooms in one, or 3 classrooms in one, I'm not quite sure which. So we lived there in a little farmhouse, which was a thatched roof. The farm had belonged to a farmer who had given it to the local burgomaster in exchange for being allowed to live there for the rest of his life and being provided with food. So that was his pension, really.
Yes.
And we lived there, and it was being a thatched roof. There were mice in the roof, and there were mice and everywhere. And the toilet was an open toilet outside, and I say open. It was in a building, but it was a dry closet. And my mother would grow vegetables and use some of that manure to fertilise the vegetables. But for food, we used to. My mother used to dry apples and plums for the winter time, and also do some preserving. I don't know where she got the knowledge from, but she must have got the knowledge from people somewhere.
Yes.
One of the things she was particularly successful at was learning the German language, because she had to blend in with the background so that nobody would understand that she was an alien. And she had to teach my brother and I German so that we didn't, by accident, speak English and give the game away. But things were changing in the east, on the Eastern Front, because the Russians were advancing on the Germans. The Germans always thought the Russians were non-people, really, and they were quite callous and unpleasant towards them, which gave the Russians plenty of propaganda, anti-German propaganda. So as civilians, we were always very much afraid of the Russian threat coming in. And from what I can gather, it was not a misplaced threat, because they were quite brutal towards the population, civil population. There was one occasion, I think it was the end of 1944, when information from my father, who was by this time navigator on bombing raids on Stalingrad, said that they were having problems with invading Russia, and he was actually the last aeroplane out of Stalingrad under fire, and as a result, he and the rest of the crew were given some sort of an award for bravery for actually achieving that. One of the unpleasant memories I overheard him talk to my mother was the Germans didn't have enough food for their own people, or only just, and so they had no food for their prisoners of war, who were in compounds out in the snow, and they were literally freezing to death.
These were Russian prisoners.
These are Russian prisoners of war. And the prisoners, therefore, some of them resorted to eating the flesh of the dead comrades, which was not a pleasant thought. But I often wondered, which part of the body did they eat first? And how did they eat it? How did they manage it? But I was a child. But January came of 1945, and it was pretty obvious that the Germans were in retreat. Eventually they approached us, they'd gone through Poland, and eventually they were so close that we could see the wood on fire behind us. And the problem then was, how were we going to flee to the west? Because it was winter time, there was snow on the ground, and you couldn't possibly walk away. It was just impossible. And so we thought, well, we'd perhaps try and catch a train, but there were no trains. And there was a train due in from the west to bring in more troops. And we said, well, if they bring in the troops, we'll get on the train and go to the west. However, before that happened, a train coming from the east, from behind the Russian lines, broke through with a German crew on. And they stopped at our village. And then there was a terrific argument because the army wanted the train to take troops away back to the front. And we said we wanted the train to go west. The local political commissar, Gauleiter, I suppose he was called, was able to pull rank, and we went on this particular train of, we're not quite sure what it has, there are open wagons.
Yes.
And the wagons were opened on the outside because if you transport animals or something like that, you wouldn't want them to open the door. So it opened from the outside and everybody piled onto these wagons. And we were then started off going west. It was snowing at the time, and I remember the snow falling on my face.
Yes.
But my mother thought, just reading her notes the other day, that I had died. I had collapsed and died. But in fact, I'd only fainted. But she thought I'd died, and therefore she was obviously very distraught. And it was just a sideline of some of the stresses that were around. So we travelled in these open wagons with the snow coming in and the freezing temperatures for about 3 days. Shortly getting onto that, I always remember I needed a pee, and somebody had brought a potty. Well, I couldn't possibly, I mean, as a 7-year-old, ever so bashful, I couldn't possibly use that. No. But they hung a blanket in the corner, and I was able to have a wee. The problem was then, there were 20 of us in this particular wagon, and everybody wanted to wee. Yes. And everybody wanted to do more than a wee. So this potty was passed around, used by people, and the contents chucked over the side. And my mother's note said, there was much laughter and frivolity at the prospect of having to do this. Obviously, the atmosphere was a positive one. Yes. But it was jolly chilly, and there was no hot food, and the only food you might have had was sandwiches. So on the way, on many stops that we had, because the railway lines had been blown up, and the driver had to find a different way of going, and we went back and forwards and tried different lines. And eventually we found a passenger train with no engine on it, but we all decided to get into there because at least they were free from the frost, and the toilets were private. Yes. I've missed something off. I forget what it was.
It might come back to you.
It might come back. So we carried on, and eventually the train driver, managed to negotiate his locomotive to collect the passenger wagons. And off we went. And eventually we arrived at a town, and it was night time, and we'd only just arrived when the lights went out and the air raid siren started, and it was the first raid on Dresden. And we were right in the middle of Dresden, in the railway station. So the driver, in a tremendous presence of mind, he'd kept his... Well, his fire was still going in the engine, so he put a bit more coal on and reversed out of Dresden. And we could see just the glow in the sky as Dresden was burning, which afterwards I realised, or I've been told, there would have been 30 and 50,000 people who had been burnt alive because the first wave of aircraft were by the British, and they had used napalm bombs, which burned the skin. They burst, so the whole city went up in flames. And when I did a little bit of research as an adult, there were a lot of photographs of people who were either asphyxiated, just immobile in wherever they were, looking over a pram at a child, but they just stopped. Or bodies had been, people who jumped into pools or swimming pools, and in the hope of escaping the heat, but the heat was so hot, the swimming pool dried out, and the person in it was burned to charcoal. I saw a photograph of a figure, obviously contorted in agony, when it was just black all over. So we came out of there. A few years later, actually, that's one of the things I want to remember. A few years later, many years later, perhaps about 30 years ago, I was at a dinner party in Whitley Bay, and one of the people there was a university lecturer, and he'd been told by one of his students that her grandfather, well, she was German, that her grandfather, when he was a boy, was fleeing from the east, from the Russians, and his parents had found him, had gone to a railway station somewhere and wanted to board a train going west to Dresden. And he created such a stink, he screamed and howled, so the family had to abandon getting on that train. And this student said that afterwards they were pleased that had happened. It must have been an act of God that boy was so angry or afraid because a train went full of refugees, went into Dresden and were burnt alive. So when I heard the story, I just couldn't help but react. And in a peculiar voice, which didn't sound like my voice at all, I said, no, they didn't die, because I was on that train. And, well, that's just stopped that dinner party, didn't it?
Yes.
Anyway, so when the train went on again, we went to another town, and the train was then emptied, and we were taken off by farm carts, different parts of the local countryside.
Yes.
When we, one of the memories I have of that place, I have a few memories. Strangely enough, thinking a lot about these things and going back, things come back. And I remember a local train, and we used to put a coin on the railway line,
Yes.
and it would flatten the coin.
Yes.
But I remember going to a school, I was obliged to, and there was barbed wire on one side, on that side of the left side of the road, and somebody in there looked out and said something to me, and I had no idea what they said. But when I got home that evening, I said, there was this man, and he said, "Hello, Ginger." My mother said, "What?" And it was a POW camp with obviously British soldiers in there. And she had me walk past. "Don't look, whatever you don't look, but what's over there?" So, but because you couldn't identify yourself too much, because by this time she was beginning to understand about revealing too much about herself. The other memory I have of that location was when we arrived, we were given a room with 3 other families in the room, and each family had a corner. And, well, you can't stay in the room all the time, and you can't carry your bags around with you all the time. So when we were out on one occasion, somebody had obviously gone through our belongings and found my mother's teaching papers. She'd left everything behind except the papers which qualified her as a teacher. And they'd found this, and they'd gone to the local political commissar. I forget the proper name. I keep calling him a Gauleiter, but I don't think that's the right name. And this little man turned up, and he wanted to take my mother and my brother and I off to a concentration camp. So they had a tremendous argument, and she pointed out that she'd done more for the German Reich than he had done because he was an old man, and she had 2 young strapping lads who were going to become Hitler Youth and eventually soldiers, and etc., etc. So that situation was diffused. He says, "Right, I'm coming back." But by this time, we weren't allowed to move without having permission. So from the Bürgermeister, and the Bürgermeister happened to be the Kommissar. So she walked to the nearest town for the Oberbürgermeister and found him in his office outside working hours and explained to him the problems she had. And he says, "Don't worry about it. I'll make a phone call. Everything will be all right." And sure enough, everything was all right. But we couldn't trust what was going on. And the Russians presumably weren't too far behind us. So my mother borrowed what they call a Leiterwagen, which was a 4-wheeled cart, wooden cart, with a handle on, but you can steer it and pull it with. And we put our 2 sacks of belongings, which consisted primarily of feather beds, because feather beds were worth having. And we then started to walk westwards from then on, from just outside Dresden, all the way west to Heidelberg, or towards Heidelberg, where my father, I think he'd been born there, and my grandmother was living there. And the rest of the journey there took us right until, well, it was from February till June when we arrived, if I remember correctly.
What year was that? Was that
1945?
Yes.
And on one occasion, it was such a hard time because we had no food and we had to go begging. I never liked begging, and I still don't. And when I see somebody begging, now, I just wonder how they got into that condition. What makes them now in the 21st century beg for some money? And I'm not comfortable with that. We had to do that. And what I did, I used to stay with the Leiterwagen out in the countryside somewhere, while my mother and my brother went into the villages to beg for food. Usually we got food, which was often simple food. I remember one occasion I was called from the Leiterwagen and, oh yeah, there's cooked food here. And it was flour soup, which is hot water with a spoonful of flour in it, which tasted awful. But it's the sort of thing you remember. And another occasion, we'd walked so long with a crowd of wagons. We weren't on our own because there were deserters, German deserters, there were more refugees, and there were people who had come from farms. And if you think of the Wild West scenes of covered wagons, well, it was a bit like that, with wagons that were sloping at the side, which was very unpleasant to sit in.
Yes.
But they had a cover on, and one place we stopped at with this whole caravan of people, and they tried to wake up the farmer, and my brother actually had fallen asleep standing up. He was propped up against the wagon. He'd absolutely fallen asleep. But sleeping in barns in the winter time in straw is cold, and it's not a very pleasant situation. But spring came and things became a little warmer. There was snow disappeared and it was easier to walk. However, pulling the wagon with my brother was 4 and I was 7. We couldn't give her much hand, so she was having to do all the work, and because not having sufficient food, she was getting weaker and she was struggling. But we were ahead of the Russians. That was the important thing. We were terrified of the Russians. And we were in a place we were told, you're in the American sector now, so thank goodness for that. So we were given a room and we stayed there. And then one day, I remember I was playing in the street, and an armoured personnel carrier came through the village from west to east. And the Americans had contacted the Russians to say they were withdrawing so many kilometres because the agreement had been that they shouldn't come so far. So the Americans withdrew, the Russians came in, and we were actually in Russian territory now. And with all the unpleasant things that would happen to the women, and the jewellery that was taken, and any valuables you had were taken. And this was March. And I remember that because one evening, my mother told my brother and I, we've got to be quiet, no noise, don't run around. I'm just going to a local farmhouse. And she did, and they had managed to hide a radio because all the radios had been confiscated. But this farmer had managed to hide a radio, and there'd been reports that there would be an announcement. I think it was the 1st of April. And the announcement did come, and my mother says there were so many people in that one room. She says you couldn't physically move. But the announcement was that Hitler had died. And that was, I think it was the 1st of April, 1945.
Probably the 1st of May.
1st of May, was it?
Or thereabouts, certainly. He died in May.
I've got the wrong date, then. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
1st of May. Then, of course, the Germans Admiral Dönitz surrendered formally 7 days later. Anyway, we were back in the Russian zone. And so my mother went round the different refugee groups to see what they were going to do. And she came across one group of about 5 or 6 people who had bought a wagon and an old horse and who were intending to flee during the night. And she said, look, can I come with you? Oh, no, you can't, because we're going to be held back by children, and we don't want that. So she produced her teaching papers and said, well, look, I'm really English. I will help you on negotiating through any of the checkpoints that we come across. And so we were accepted with some reluctance. And so we set off in the middle of the night. And I remember there was a bucket full of boiled potatoes between 8 of us. And you would, if you were hungry, you'd have a boiled potato. But we were off. And we managed to get through the various checkpoints. And there was one checkpoint in particular, which was an American soldier. A checkpoint, by the way, would consider just as an armed guard, just checking the papers of people going through, who said, if you go a kilometre further on, there's a Russian camp there, and he says the Russians are transferring everybody to a labour camp. If you want to go there, well, that's the way to go. And my mother said, well, we want to go to the American zone. He said, all the access in that area is controlled by both Americans and Russians, except a mile back. If you go through a particular country lane, you'll come to a stream, and there's a bridge across the stream, and it's only got one American guard on it. So that's what we did. And my mother tried to negotiate with the guard, the GI, to let us through, but he had instructions not to let us through. And she says eventually she managed to convince him. He said, well, look, I'll turn the other way, and I won't see you then. So we then uncoupled the horse from the wagon, and we just got the wagon across that narrow bridge just by inches, apparently. And then we're back in the American zone. On the way, the 4 people we had, people we were travelling with, we didn't ask who they were because we never knew who they were. However, one of them turned out to be a friend of Dr. Goebbels' family. Goebbels was the propaganda minister. So she had a good reason for keeping quiet by association. And another one was a tank commander, a German tank commander, who hadn't any papers. So one day, apparently, we went to a Bürgermeister's room, all of us, crowded into his office. There was a real reason for that. And we were brought along, and I was told to misbehave. Misbehave? Misbehave.
Yes.
And while this actually was taking place, when the Bürgermeister had his back turned, he was looking for something behind him, somebody picked up his stamp and stamped up a blank pass, yes, which kept the tank commander, gave him a validity. He had now a passport, in effect a Reisepass, which is a passport. So they were happy, but it also meant that because we'd been to this Bürgermeister, we could get food. We had permission to buy food, if there was any available. We had a lot of GIs, a lot of lorries of American soldiers going past on the road. And sometimes they would take pity on us and would throw us their iron rations, which were all sealed in wax. Mm. And then we would get one of these, a lunch of an individual, and we would open the packet and share it amongst 8 of us.
Yes.
On one occasion, my mother's notes say they came across a a place with a lot of plums and something else. So everybody gorged themselves on plums. The problem was that Bowers didn't appreciate that, and because out in the open, there are no toilets, so everybody walk on while I just stay behind for a minute.
Yes.
And of course, there were no newspapers, there was no toilet paper. It was, you had to use grass or the best you could, which wasn't very easy. There were some things else. It's just for the moment, one of the things I remember being in American Zone, I was playing on burnt out tanks. And I overheard the adults saying, "Oh, these Americans are peculiar people. They've got even chewing gum." So chewing gum, I thought, what's chewing gum? It's rubber. So I found a piece of black rubber and I tried to chew it. Well, it was a bit of a tyre from a lorry, and I decided that wasn't for me.
No.
The other memory I have was walking along a country road. You see, I have memories, and I can't always recall them easily now, but they keep coming back.
Yes.
Walking on country road, and on the right-hand side was a convoy, a German convoy, or what had been a convoy, of lorries and vehicles of all sorts, and they were riddled with holes because obviously they'd been strafed. And so we were walking along this particular road and we saw an aeroplane in the sky, and we sort of watched it carefully, and then it turned around and it started coming towards us. And we all ran to the side of the road as far away from the centre as we could, because that aeroplane was not friendly. It was obviously determined to get us, but it didn't. But at the time, I remember I got my ears boxed because I should have gone to lie down where my mother told me to, because she said she was going to lie on top of us so that any bullets would come through would be stopped by her body. And of course, thinking about it now as an adult, it would never have done that. It would have gone straight through her. However, that's the way she was. And so I got into trouble for that. But these memories of the bombing and the strafing are problems I suffer with now, which is why I get emotional. Because they've really sensitized me in a way I never thought it was possible. So a year or two ago, I was in France and an aeroplane came past and it turned round. I thought it was coming for me.
Yes.
Another occasion, in this country, I found I was standing behind a tree. I thought, what the hell are you doing behind a tree? It was a police helicopter going overhead, and I was hiding. Just automatic reactions. Another automatic reaction was, I'd been to Theatre Royal to see the Glenn Miller story, thank you. And it was all good and jazzy, and, you know, the Americans were there, actors dressed up as Americans, and it took me right back to those days. Nothing wrong with it. It was a bit strange to be reminded of where I was when I was 7, 8 and 9. But it was okay. But the end of the story was an air raid. The siren went, and I remember so many sirens in Berlin. And the bombs fell, good sound effects in the theatre. But I was on the floor, hiding, you know, an adult, just reacting like that, instinctively.
Of course.
Not premeditated. So it's left its mark on me in a way. But we carried on walking westward towards Heidelberg. And then my mother couldn't go on anymore. She was so ill, partly with heat stroke, because by this time it was June, I think. Excuse me. And partly with lack of food. So we left the Leiterwagen at a railway station to be collected later on. And we took the next train towards Heidelberg. But of course, there were no passenger wagons, so you just sat wherever you could on a wagon, goods wagons, legs hanging out the side. And we arrived in Heidelberg, where my mother had been, grandmother had been, but she had been a very prominent person. She used to own the pre-war in the 1920s, the Hotel Prince Karl, which was a watering hole for European aristocracy. And when the inflation period came in the 1920s, she lost it all. But she was a well-known figure. And that Prince Karl Hotel still stands, but no longer as a hotel, but now as a municipal building. So we eventually found her. And the account of my mother says she went to a particular street and she wasn't there. And she went to another street and she wasn't there. And we went back and forwards across the river by boat, because the Germans had blown up the bridges to stop the Americans advancing. And eventually she managed to find somebody who said, "Oh, Frau Gärtner, she lives in a certain street." So we went there, and she rang the bell, and the intercom said, "Yes, what do you want?" And she says, "You know, I'm Frau Gärtner, and I'm looking for my mother-in-law." "Oh, she's in the garden." And this bit of my mother's story always makes me upset. Nothing horrific. But she says she went in the garden and there was a pair of legs underneath or behind a bedsheet being hung up to dry. It was my grandmother. And we were safe after that. Well, we were safe anyway. But being refugees, we were allocated a room eventually. But again, there was no food, and my grandmother took me along with her to visit the various farms who used to supply the hotel, and say, "Have you got some potatoes?" "Oh no, Frau Gärtner, we haven't anything." "Oh, well, you've got something enough for yourself. You can have a little bit for us." And I was passive there. It wasn't as painful for me begging with my grandmother, because she was doing the begging, as it had been with my mother. But eventually there was no food. But my mother had been enterprising, and there was an American hospital in Heidelberg. So she went there, and she says, "I can speak English, here are my teaching papers." And she was given a job as an interpreter, because they employed a lot of Germans for doing various tasks. And eventually she became the personnel manager. Now, that is a high-profile thing, and if you're employing people, it can be a difficult thing. Now, we were the three of us living in a single room in Heidelberg, and I remember people would knock on the door and come in and say, can you get us a job?" No, I can't give you. Well, I'll give you something, you know. And they were promising all sorts of things. And one that I remember in particular, this man brought out of his pocket an egg. He says, I will give you this egg if you give me a job. I don't know where you got the egg from. And my mother said, no, I can't do that. Well, I'll give you an egg a week if you give me a job. No, I can't do that. And eventually this person went away. But that was the sort of value that people had on them. Once we'd registered with the authorities, we were given food parcels which had been produced by the Quakers through an organisation called Quaker Hilfe, I think it was called. And then that was replaced by the Red Cross bringing food parcels in, obviously mainly financed by the Americans, who financed the war generally. And so we saved up a lot of food parcels in that way. And on one occasion, we actually bartered one for a feather bed. Another memory I have of that, I was dressed and had my hair combed and washed, and I had a bag, a shopping bag, with a newspaper in the bottom. Don't disturb the newspaper. Don't talk to anybody. Don't do anything. Just go to such and such a shop and ask for Herr so-and-so. And no questions asked, just do it. So I went to this shopping bag, went to Herr so-and-so. What do you want? I can want to speak to Mr. so-and-so. Oh yes, come in the back. And underneath the pieces of paper was some money, which had been sent from Hamburg by my father to buy American cigarettes. And I was a courier. So I had this bag with a cigarettes, couple of cartons of cigarettes, I think it's only 2, and a newspaper on the top. And I was stopped by the Americans. And I thought, oh dear. But it was just sundown, and they were lowering the American flag, and they were expected all pedestrians to stop there. And so I was all right. But my parents had made contact with each other because she had written, I don't know how I know at one stage there was no post, and she would take the letter to the railway station to see if anybody's going to Hamburg, and then she would give that person the letter for that person to deliver the letter. How they got in touch with her, I think he must have contacted his mother and said, I'm in Hamburg. He'd surrendered to the British, so he was living up there in the British sector. But eventually my parents, we moved up to Hamburg. My parents were divorced, and my brother and I, with my mother, came to England. And that was a very painful parting. Mm. But it was the beginning of another difficult time of our lives. Not the same difficulty, but there was a lot of, this is 1949, there was a lot of anti-German feeling in this country. And we had to go to school. We were obliged to go to school. Well, I was, 49, 12. And I'd sensed the anti-German feeling, so I just didn't argue, I just kept out of the way. But my brother didn't, so he was in a lot of fights. He was just 3 years younger than me. But because of that, we had to change our name. We thought it was wise to change our name from Gärtner to Gardner. And the only difference is you take off the umlaut of the A, and the T becomes a D. And I was registered, because if I was a young lad, I was registered as an alien. And I had to report to the police station in Newcastle every now and again to say, I'm still here, I haven't escaped, or whatever.
Yes.
And it was a difficult time because I had to deny my German background, my German language, the music, and things like this. It was homecoming for my mother, in a sense, which when she went, she was an Anglican. When she went to the church, she wasn't allowed to take communion because she was divorced. It was a high church. And the Sunday school was in the afternoon. And she said, well, we went to an Anglo-German club, which had been set up by the Quakers for German POWs who wanted to stay behind, who made contacts in this country. And she went to keep up her German language skill. And she was talking to this man on one occasion and said, look, I want my kids to go to Sunday school, but it's on a Sunday afternoon, and we've been used in Germany, go for a walk on Sunday afternoon. This is a social occasion, family time. And he said, well, our Sunday school is in the morning. And she said, well, who are you? He says, well, I'm a Quaker. And so we started going to Quaker Sunday school. And cutting a long story short, I'm a Quaker now. So very briefly, from what I can remember off the cuff, that's my German story. But there's more because we had to settle into this country and so on. And
tell me a little bit about that. I mean, because you were 12 years old, your brother would have been 9, presumably, at that time. I mean, you've a big change for you.
It was a massive change.
Yeah.
First of all, there was, apart from the coupons and the pocket money and the strange coins,
yes.
Big copper pennies, and things like florins and crowns and half crowns and things like this. It wasn't easy. But I learned the language particularly we had to live with my grandparents, and because we're restless kids, we were shoved out in the back lane, and this is where I learned my English. I had a little bit of English before we left Heidelberg, and they tried to teach it in schools, but I'd never had schooling, so learning was a difficult thing anyway. So we settled in, and I'm not sure, we lived with a grandmother grandparents for some time, and then we got a flat of our own in Baker. And I must have been about 15 then, because I left school and I became an office boy. But one of the consequences of all that was I was office boy, but my mother felt she had to come to the personnel manager to give him a job in case there wasn't a job. And because of the way he comes from a divorced family, so there was a stigma there all the time. When I joined, of course, my name's Curt. Oh, we've got another Curt, an ex-POW, down in the light assembly shop. The company, C.A. Parsons, employed 10,000 people or thereabouts, but they all knew about that one man. Now they know about the second man.
Yes.
So I became recognised. Well, not because I was a particular outgoing personality, but red hair, German. But it meant that cumulatively, I've become an outsider. Now, Wendy, my wife, may not agree with that, but unless you walk in my shoes, you won't know what it's like. But I was an outsider in Heidelberg when we first came off the trek, because I was a refugee. and they resented the refugees coming in and taking away their rooms. And the kids who were there, who weren't refugees, they had toboggans and not roller skates, what do you call them, scooters.
Yes.
And I didn't, so I had to keep borrowing theirs. And, so there was a bit of a difference there. And when we came to England, there was this anti-German feeling. And there was all sorts of things I just can't remember offhand. Eventually it became a way of life for me. Not in the 1960s, there was still a lot of strong feelings about religious communities, and so I was a Quaker. So if that person was an Anglican, well, you've got to be careful because, you know. And we used to go and chase the Catholics up there. There was a Catholic school. Yeah, get the bricks and throw it at them. Well, it was still that sort of atmosphere. So I was still an outsider, and that continued on into my adulthood. I can't offhand think of examples of it.
So do you feel you've always been an outsider?
Yes, I do. Not as a kid. But now I'm in a lucky position just now. I'm married to Wendy, who's a Catholic, and she has a most wonderful group of friends.
Yes.
They're not any old Catholic group, but they were a Catholic group, about 30 odd of them, with charismatic leanings, and the bonds that developed were very strong, especially living in the same village as Hebburn. They know each other, they brought up the kids together, their kids know their kids, and it's a very closely knit community. And marrying Wendy, I became part of that community. And having learned to keep a low profile, I was eventually accepted by them. Not that they were ever against me in any way. It's just that somebody would now say, well, you remember that, Curt? Oh, no, you weren't here then. So I've been integrated so much so that as if I'm part of the group anyway, which is a lovely feeling. I've never had that before.
Yes.
It's a feeling of being included.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful.
Have you been in this country 70 years?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm coming up to my 82nd birthday now.
Yes.
Your Saturday night.
What?
Your Saturday night club was important.
The part of my time with the Quakers, I grew up with them. I was dragged up by them, really,
yes.
Because I'd never had a regular family life, and so there was my mother was always out, my father wasn't there, and so discipline was exerted by my grandmother, and there was very little of it. But being at this Anglo-German club, which was held on Quaker premises, the two of this lad and I was to explore. And there were only two of us, so we would go right round the building and more on the roof and wherever we could. And we discovered there was a badminton hall as part of the premises. And there were people playing badminton. So we just sat and watched. So these people in their late teens, early 20s, would play badminton. And then when they stopped, for a cup of tea, Alan and I would get the rackets and play badminton until they came out, and then we would scurry back again. And so every month, or whenever it was, we would do this, until eventually these young people didn't appear. And so we went exploring. We found the cupboard where they kept the badminton gear, and the two of us played badminton. And then we thought, well, it's not much fun just the two of us, so we invited the kids from the Sunday school. So come to the meeting house and play badminton, table tennis, snooker. It was all there. Parents must have asked questions. What about supervision? And there was no supervision. There's just a crowd of us. And my friend and I would be, as I said, unruly. We'd be on the roof. We'd be all over the place. And the meeting eventually decided they would need some sort of supervision. And we resented that. So I remember spending hours making a black notice board with skull and crossbones on the top, saying we're independent. However, in the end, we were controlled very gently, in a very subtle way. It was amazing. We resented some of the initial people coming in, but then there was a little man came in. He was no higher than us, and so he was acceptable. That youth club eventually grew to about 30 or 40 young people because people would bring their friends along. And then we would put country dance records on. We would do some country dancing. And so that Saturday night club carried on for years and years until I was, I don't know, until I must have been about 40, something like that. First 20 or 30 years anyway, which was good. Yeah, that was something good.
Large amount of your story is really around the legacy of the war and how it's affected you. What would you say to people today, youngsters today, who are going out into the world as sort of things that you would advise them to do, if you like, to lead a life that's not stressful, if you like, and maybe a life that could make them successful? Do you have any advice for young people today?
That's a difficult one. The answer is yes and no. The important thing is to be yourself and to accept other people, irrespective of their backgrounds or their beliefs. And that's very important, because in my 30s I worked very extensively with Quakers in the ecumenical movement, trying to encourage the churches to work together harmoniously. And to a lot of extent it has happened, but it's stopped now because the impetus is gone. It's the extreme views which cause problems. And it's not just extreme views, but also the extreme views are fueled by ignorance. And there's very little one can do about somebody who's never been taught something different. Because one of the things that we do without questioning it is, if we're given some information that sounds authoritative and we've never had that information before, then that is the truth. It doesn't matter what it happens to be, whether it's a political or whether it's religious. If somebody says that is the truth, and then you accept that. And unfortunately, a lot of things like that happen with people. And now people will say, oh, well, so-and-so is taking our jobs away. The immigrants are taking our jobs away. Yes. Well, they're not taking... They're doing jobs which the locals don't want to do. But because they're told that, and it's obvious, it appears to be like that, then they accept it. So yes. Advising young people, travel as much as you can,
yes.
And learn different cultures and different views.
That's right.
That's the only way I think you can understand.
Curt, thank you very much for sharing your life. I think you've done fantastically well.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for doing it.
Okay, it was my pleasure.